On a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan, Miller's kitchen glowed like a beacon against the October chill. The small corner restaurant occupied barely more than a storefront, its hand-painted sign weathered but welcoming, steam rising from windows like gentle promises of comfort. Inside, Thomas Miller moved with practiced rhythm, his calloused hands stirring butternut squash soup while listening to his daughter's pencil scratching paper behind him. At 35, Thomas carried quiet strength earned through weathering storms. His sandy brown hair showed silver threads at the temples, green eyes holding depth that came from holding his dying wife's hand and then learning to braid his 7-year-old daughter's hair with those same fingers. Sarah sat perched on a makeshift desk behind the counter. School books spread like fallen leaves, occasionally watching her father work with the reverence children reserve for heroes. The restaurant told stories in weathered brick and carefully tended details. Mismatched chairs surrounded tables. Thomas had refinished himself, each bearing character marks of countless shared meals. Walls displayed children's drawings. Not just Sarah's, but dozens from kids whose parents had found refuge here. This wasn't just business, it was sanctuary, where anyone could set down the world's weight and remember what being cared for felt like. Thomas had opened Miller's kitchen 3 years after losing Elena to cancer. In dark months following her death, when grief sat like stone on his chest and Sarah's questions about mommy felt impossible to answer, cooking became prayer and therapy. Elena had been the dreamer with grand plans. Thomas was the anchor, finding meaning in feeding people well, creating peace in lives, holding too little. The restaurant began as survival. It became service. Each day brought small miracles and challenges. Mrs. Rodriguez came Wednesdays for chicken and rice that reminded her of her late husband. Jake, the construction worker, stopped before dawn for coffee and breakfast sandwiches, always leaving extra for the kids' college fund. Sarah did homework in the warm kitchen, learning arithmetic while fresh bread filled the air, understanding that success wasn't measured in dollars but in people leaving your table less alone. The city beyond those windows moved differently, driven by ambitions and acquisitions. But inside Miller's kitchen, time moved like honey, sweet and unhurried. Thomas had learned that profound connections happen not in boardrooms, but in sharing meals prepared with love by hands understanding the difference between feeding hunger and nourishing souls. As afternoon light faded and rain drummed harder, Thomas adjusted the flame and smiled at Sarah quietly reading aloud. In 2 hours, dinner service would begin, not a rush, but steady neighbors and friends who knew they could find what expensive restaurants uptown never provided. Being known, welcomed, fed not just food, but hope. The doorbell chimed. Thomas looked up to see a figure silhouetted against gray afternoon. What he couldn't know was this customer would change everything. Not just for him, but for a woman whose name graced skyscraper tops and magazine covers, yet who was about to discover that the most valuable currency was one she'd never learned to spend. Emily Harrington stepped through Miller's kitchen's door like someone fleeing a storm. Though the tempest she carried was less weather than life's weight lived in success's relentless spotlight. At 29, she commanded a $3.7 billion real estate empire, her decisions reshaping entire neighborhoods with single signatures. Her tailored coat, costing more than most earned in 6 months, dripped rainwater onto worn wooden floors as she stood cradling a bundle representing both greatest joy and deepest fear. Grace, barely 3 months old, had been crying for 2 hours. Not normal infant fussiness, but sustained wailing, echoing from somewhere deeper than hunger or discomfort, sound reaching into Emily's chest, reminding her of feeling unprepared for this most important role. Her driver waited in the black sedan outside, engine running, ready to whisk her to the next appointment. But for these precious minutes, Emily was simply a mother at rope's end, seeking shelter from storms beyond October's sky. Emily's life had been controlled perfection since childhood. Raised by a father, viewing emotion as weakness, and a mother who died when Emily was 14, she'd navigated through intellect and determination rather than intuition and feeling. Harvard Business School at 22, first major acquisition at 24, and by 27, she was Manhattan Development's most formidable woman. Magazines loved her ice queen persona, walking into rooms full of older men and emerging with exactly what she wanted. But they never asked about control's cost. How skills making her powerful in boardrooms left her helpless facing her daughter's tears. Grace had been unexpected, result of a brief relationship with a man more interested in Emily's wealth than heart. When he disappeared upon learning of pregnancy, Emily decided to raise the child alone, believing determination that built her empire could handle one small person. But babies didn't respond to quarterly projections. They needed what she'd spent her adult life suppressing: vulnerability, admitting uncertainty, trusting beyond her considerable capabilities. The crying started that morning during a board meeting about her company's largest acquisition. $500 million hung in balance, and Grace chose that moment to dissolve into inconsolable tears despite being fed, changed, and burped according to manuals. Emily had studied like battle plans. The nanny was sick, her assistant handling a Chicago crisis, and suddenly, the woman who could negotiate complex international deals found herself holding a screaming baby, feeling more lost than those dark days after her mother's funeral. By 4:30, Emily had admitted defeat and asked her driver to simply drive while she tried everything to comfort Grace. They'd been circling the city for an hour when rain started, and Emily spotted warm light spilling from Miller's kitchen onto wet sidewalk. Something about that golden glow called to her, not as Emily Harrington, real estate mogul, but as a woman carrying a crying baby and desperately needing to believe that somewhere in this vast, impersonal city, there might be shelter. Standing in the doorway, rain dripping from her coat, and Grace's cries echoing off brick walls, Emily experienced profound disorientation. This was so far from her world of gleaming offices that she almost turned around. But then she saw him, a man with gentle eyes and flour-dusted hands who looked at her not as intruder, but as exactly the person he'd been expecting all along. Thomas set down his wooden spoon and moved around the counter with unhurried confidence of someone understanding that panic was contagious but calm could be too. He approached Emily not with curiosity about who she was, but with immediate recognition of a fellow parent in need. In his years running Miller's kitchen, he'd become neighborhood sage, the person people turned to not just for good food but for steady presence reminding them the world could still be caring. "That little one sounds like she's having quite a day," Thomas said, his voice carrying warmth of someone who'd spent countless nights walking floors with his own crying child. He gestured toward a corner table. "Why don't you sit down? Sometimes babies pick up on our stress more than we realize." Emily found herself following his suggestion, sinking into the chair as if her legs had been waiting for permission to stop holding her up. Grace's cries seemed to intensify in enclosed space, and Emily felt her cheeks burn with shame of being unable to comfort her own child. In boardrooms, she was known for composure under pressure, thinking 3 steps ahead of any problem. But here, with her daughter's needs demanding immediate solution she couldn't strategize toward, Emily felt as helpless as those terrible months after her mother's death. Thomas was already moving toward the kitchen, returning with a small bowl smelling like autumn afternoons and grandmother's kitchens. "Mind if I try something?" he asked. And when Emily nodded, he gently took Grace with easy confidence of someone who'd held many babies through countless difficult nights. What happened next seemed like fairy tale to Emily. Thomas sat across from her, cradling Grace while using a small spoon to let her taste just a drop of butternut squash soup, cooled to perfect temperature. The baby's cries stuttered, then stopped entirely as her tiny tongue explored this new flavor. Her eyes, so much like Emily's own dark brown, focused on Thomas's face with attention babies usually reserved for their mothers. "How did you?" Emily whispered, voice catching on emotions she couldn't name. In 3 months of motherhood, she'd never seen Grace respond to anyone else with such immediate trust. Pediatricians, nannies she'd interviewed, even Emily herself. None had achieved in hours what this stranger accomplished in moments. Thomas smiled, continuing to offer Grace tiny tastes while explaining. "My daughter Sarah went through a phase like this when she was about Grace's age. Nothing would calm her except this particular soup. My wife Elena used to say babies can taste love, that they know when something is made with real care rather than just technical skill." His eyes grew distant, touched by sadness Emily recognized as grief worn smooth by time. "After Elena passed away, this soup became my secret weapon for difficult days. Not just for Sarah, but for anyone who needed extra comfort." Emily watched, transfixed, as Grace settled completely in Thomas's arms, tiny fist gripping his finger while she continued tasting the soup with obvious contentment. The silence that fell over the restaurant felt different from oppressive quiet of Emily's penthouse office. This was warm silence of problem solved, small crisis met with exactly the right response. For the first time in months, Emily felt her shoulders relax, constant tension melting away like snow in spring sunshine. Sarah appeared from behind the counter, approaching with curiosity bright in eyes so much like her father's. At 7, she possessed that wonderful ability children have to accept the unusual as perfectly normal. She settled into the empty chair, as if joining strangers was something she did every afternoon. "Is the baby feeling better now?" Sarah asked, reaching out to gently touch Grace's tiny hand. "Daddy's soup fixes almost everything. When I have bad dreams or miss Mommy too much, Daddy makes me soup and tells me stories until I feel better inside." Emily looked at this little girl, so confident, so secure in her father's love, and felt something shift inside her chest. Here was a child who'd lost her mother, being raised by a single parent, yet who radiated settled happiness. Emily had spent her adult life believing was impossible without perfect circumstances. Sarah's school uniform was clearly from a public school. Her shoes showed signs of careful repair rather than replacement, yet she carried herself with contentment Emily's wealth had never purchased. "Your daddy is very good at taking care of people," Emily said, voice still rough with tears. "I think your soup might be magic." Sarah giggled, a sound like water over stones. "That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says. She comes here every Wednesday, because she says Daddy's food reminds her that the world is still good even when it feels scary. Daddy says cooking is like giving people a hug from the inside." Thomas met Emily's eyes over his daughter's head, and she saw in them depth of understanding that spoke to experiences she could only imagine. Here was a man who'd faced loss and hardship, raising a child alone in a city that could be brutally indifferent to struggle, yet who'd transformed that pain into a gift he shared with anyone walking through his door. The contrast with her own life, privileged, protected, but somehow empty of exactly this kind of genuine human connection, was almost overwhelming. Grace had fallen asleep in Thomas's arms, her small body completely relaxed against his chest, breathing deep and even. Emily stared at her daughter's peaceful face and felt the weight of all her inadequacies as a mother settling around her like heavy coat. She'd given Grace the finest nursery money could buy, best pediatric care available, every material advantage imaginable. But she'd never been able to give her what this stranger provided in minutes. Simple gift of being truly present, truly calm, truly focused on what Grace needed rather than what Emily thought she should need. "I should probably take her home," Emily said quietly, though every part wanted to stay in this warm, golden space where her daughter slept peacefully, and she felt more grounded than in months. "You probably need to get ready for dinner service." Thomas shook his head gently. "No rush. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is just sit with what's working." He adjusted Grace slightly. "Besides, Sarah and I were about to have our afternoon snack. You're welcome to join us." Grace seems pretty content where she island. Emily found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to stay. Something about this place, these people, had created space where her usual defenses felt unnecessary. For the first time since Grace's birth, she wasn't thinking about the next meeting, next crisis, next decision requiring immediate attention. She was simply here, in this moment, watching her daughter sleep in the arms of a man whose kindness felt as natural as breathing. Sarah disappeared into the kitchen and returned with homemade cookies and tea. She served Emily with serious concentration of a child taught that hospitality was both art and responsibility. The cookies were still warm, clearly baked that afternoon, and they tasted like childhood memories Emily wasn't sure she'd ever actually had. Sweet, simple, made with ingredients that couldn't be bought but had to be given freely. "Your family is very lucky to have such a wonderful restaurant," Emily said, though even as she spoke, she realized how inadequate the words were for what she was trying to express. This wasn't really about the restaurant at all, but about something harder to name, a quality of attention, of care, of being fully present in each moment. Thomas smiled, but Emily caught a flicker of sadness crossing his features. "It's just Sarah and me now," he said gently. "Her mom passed away when Sarah was 4. We've learned to take care of each other." The simplicity of this philosophy, the way Thomas spoke about love as something that could be actively practiced rather than passively felt, struck Emily with unexpected force. In her world, love was something that happened to you or didn't. But here was a man talking about love as a choice, as daily practice, as something that grew stronger when given away, rather than weaker. Grace stirred in Thomas's arms, making soft sounds babies make when transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. Emily instinctively reached for her daughter, but Thomas shook his head gently. "Let's see if she'll take a little more soup first," he suggested. Sometimes when babies wake up from a good nap, they're ready to try new things. He offered Grace another tiny taste, and again she accepted readily, dark eyes focusing on his face with what seemed like recognition. Emily watched this interaction with mixture of gratitude and something dangerously close to envy. Not envy of Thomas, exactly, but of the ease with which he navigated territory that felt so foreign despite being her daughter's mother. As the dinner service began, Emily found herself witnessing high-performance work in real time. Orders came steadily, each requiring coordination between kitchen and servers, timing that ensured hot food reached tables while still perfect. Thomas moved between stove and customers with economy of motion speaking to years of practice, but also with quality of attention that transformed routine tasks into something approaching art. Sarah helped where she could, carrying water glasses with serious concentration of someone understanding she was part of something important. Emily watched her interact with customers with social confidence many adults never developed. She complimented Mrs. Chen's haircut, asked Mr. Patterson about his grandson's soccer game, and helped a young mother manage her toddler, all with natural grace of someone raised to see service to others as both normal and valuable. This was different success than anything Emily had witnessed. There were no profit margins to analyze, no competitors to outmaneuver. There was simply daily practice of paying attention to what people needed and providing it as well as possible. The restaurant was busy but not frantic, profitable but not focused on maximizing every dollar, successful in ways that couldn't be measured by metrics that had governed Emily's adult life. When Grace finished nursing and fell back asleep, Emily emerged to find dinner rush in earnest. Every table was occupied, but atmosphere remained unhurried, almost festive. These weren't customers. They were neighbors, friends, people who came here not just for food but for sense of community. Thomas and Sarah had created around their simple mission of feeding people well. "I should probably go," Emily said reluctantly, gathering her things while trying not to disturb Grace's sleep. "You're busy, and I've already taken up so much of your time." Thomas looked up from the order he was plating, hands never pausing. "You haven't taken up anything. You've been part of what we do here. Grace is welcome anytime, and so are you." The sincerity in his voice made Emily's chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. When was the last time someone had made her feel welcome not because of who she was or what she could provide, but simply because she was a fellow human being in need of kindness? Sarah appeared with a small paper bag. "I packed some cookies for later," she said with pleased expression of someone giving a gift they knew would be appreciated. "And Daddy put some soup in a container in case Grace gets fussy again." Sometimes babies need the same thing that made them feel better before. Emily accepted the bag with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by generosity of people who had no reason to extend such care to a stranger. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt insufficient. "Both of you, I don't know what I would have done if you would have figured it out," Thomas said firmly but kindly. "Parents always do, eventually. Sometimes we just need a little help along the way." As Emily made her way toward the door with Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms, she turned back once more to look at Thomas and Sarah working together in their small corner of the world. Father and daughter moved around each other, with unconscious choreography of people who'd learned to function as a team, creating something greater than the sum of their individual efforts. The rain had stopped, and evening air felt washed clean, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when she'd stumbled through Miller's Kitchen's door 2 hours earlier. Her driver was waiting, ready to return her to glass towers and marble lobbies of her familiar world. But as Emily settled into leather seats with Grace still sleeping against her chest, she found herself thinking not about contracts waiting on her desk, but about the way Thomas had looked at her daughter, not as a problem to be solved, but as a small person deserving of patience and respect. For the first time since Grace's birth, Emily allowed herself to imagine that maybe she might be capable of becoming the kind of mother her daughter deserved. Not the perfect mother her strategic mind insisted she should be, but the present mother Thomas had shown her it was possible to become. It would mean letting go of some control, accepting that the most important things couldn't be scheduled or managed. It would mean learning to trust in something beyond her own considerable abilities. As the car pulled away from Miller's Kitchen and back into Manhattan traffic, Emily made a silent promise to herself, and to the sleeping child in her arms. She would return, not because she needed Thomas to solve her problems, but because she'd glimpsed something in that warm, golden space that she wanted to understand better. She'd seen what it looked like when love was practiced as daily discipline rather than held as theoretical concept. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Emily Harrington found herself wanting to learn how to live with that same kind of courage, that same commitment to choosing connection over protection, presence over perfection. Grace stirred in her arms, and Emily held her closer, thinking about butternut squash soup and the way a gentleman's voice could transform a crying baby's afternoon into something that felt remarkably like hope. The weeks that followed Emily's first visit to Miller's Kitchen passed with strange quality, as if someone had adjusted the color saturation of her previously black and white existence. She found herself thinking about Thomas and Sarah at unexpected moments. During board meetings, while reviewing contracts that suddenly seemed less urgent, in quiet minutes before sleep when Grace lay peaceful and Emily marveled at how much easier bedtime had become. The soup Thomas had sent home had indeed proven magical on 2 subsequent difficult afternoons, though Emily suspected the real magic lay not in any particular ingredient but in the intention behind its creation. Someone had made this food specifically to comfort, to nourish not just bodies but spirits, and that knowledge seemed to communicate itself to Grace in ways that all of Emily's research had failed to achieve. But it was more than practical relief that drew Emily's thoughts back to Miller's Kitchen. Something fundamental had shifted during those 2 hours, something that made her penthouses feel simultaneously more luxurious and more hollow. She'd experienced human connection that her wealth had always insulated her from. Not calculated networking but simple recognition between people who saw each other as fully human. Emily's assistant, Margaret, noticed the change first. "You seem different this week," Margaret observed during their Thursday briefing. More present, I suppose. Less like you're running towards something, and more like you're paying attention to where you already are. These small revelations accumulated throughout the week, creating growing awareness that she'd been operating in emotional isolation she'd mistaken for professional focus. The efficiency she'd prized began feeling less like virtue and more like defense mechanism, a way of moving through the world without acknowledging the full humanity of everyone encountered along the way. Friday evening found Emily making a decision that would have seemed unthinkable weeks earlier. Instead of reviewing weekend reports, she called her driver and asked him to take her to Miller's kitchen during what Thomas had mentioned was their busiest prep period. She arrived to find the restaurant in full preparation mode, with Thomas and Sarah working alongside two part-time staff members. The kitchen hummed with organized energy that reminded Emily of her office during major launches, but with atmosphere of collaboration rather than competition, support rather than pressure. Thomas looked up from vegetables he was chopping and smiled with genuine pleasure. Emily, perfect timing. We're just getting ready for the weekend rush. Sarah emerged from behind plates she'd been organizing, face lighting up when she saw Grace. Can Grace watch me make dinner rolls? I'm getting really good at the braiding part, and babies like to watch people work with their hands. Emily found herself settling into the restaurant's rhythm with surprising ease. What struck her most forcefully was how different this work environment felt from her own. There was intensity here, pressure of deadlines, need for precision, coordination required when multiple people worked toward common goals, but none of the underlying tension she'd assumed was inseparable from professional achievement. People helped each other without being asked, anticipated needs without formal communication protocols, and took genuine pride in collective success rather than individual recognition. How do you manage performance? Emily asked Thomas during a brief pause. How do you ensure everyone maintains standards without creating competitive pressure? Thomas considered the question thoughtfully. I suppose we start with understanding that we're all trying to create the same thing, he said. When people feel like they're part of something meaningful, they usually want to do it well. When they feel like they're competing for resources or recognition, they focus more on protecting themselves than supporting the team. As Emily's involvement deepened from consultation to partnership, the changes rippled through both her personal life and business empire in ways that challenged everything she'd believed about success. The woman who had once measured progress in quarterly earnings was now finding fulfillment in smaller victories. A customer's smile when they tasted perfectly prepared food, an employee's growing confidence, a child's delight in helping prepare meals for their community. The transition wasn't without complications. Emily's traditional business associates watched her increasing involvement with puzzlement. Several board members questioned whether her attention to Miller's kitchen might compromise her focus on the real estate empire that had made her reputation. But Emily discovered that energy gained from work aligned with her values more than compensated for additional time commitment. Strategic thinking applied to Miller's kitchen felt invigorating rather than draining, creative rather than repetitive. She found herself approaching her real estate projects with new questions. How could this development serve the community? What kind of businesses should occupy ground floor spaces to create genuine neighborhood gathering places? How could construction create jobs that supported working families? These questions led to innovations that surprised everyone. Instead of simply seeking highest bidding tenants, she began prioritizing businesses that would contribute to community well-being. Local grocers, independent bookstores, family-owned restaurants, services that neighborhood residents actually needed. Instead of designing buildings purely for efficiency, she started incorporating common spaces, community gardens, and flexible areas for events and gatherings. The financial results defied conventional wisdom about real estate development. Buildings designed with community needs in mind attracted more stable, long-term tenants. Developments that prioritized neighborhood integration experienced less resistance during approval processes and faster lease-up rates. Projects that created genuine value commanded premium rents while generating positive publicity that enhanced Emily's company's reputation. Grace was thriving in this new environment, spending time both at Miller's kitchen and at Emily's office, where she'd become something of a mascot for the company's evolving culture. Employees who had never interacted with Emily on personal levels found themselves sharing parenting advice. The conference room was equipped with a high chair and baby supplies, and important meetings regularly paused for feeding or diaper changes without anyone treating these interruptions as unusual. You're modeling something really important, Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Emily conduct a strategic planning session, while Grace contentedly explored safe office supplies, organized specifically for her entertainment. You're showing everyone that success doesn't require sacrificing the things that matter most. People are working harder than ever, but they're also more satisfied than I've ever seen them. Emily realized Margaret was right in ways that went beyond workplace dynamics. She was demonstrating to Grace, and to everyone around her, that professional achievement and personal fulfillment didn't have to be competing priorities. That leadership could be about service rather than control. That success could be measured in terms of contribution rather than acquisition. The Saturday lunch expansion at Miller's Kitchen had become a laboratory for these principles. With Emily and Thomas collaborating on systems that prioritized both operational excellence and human well-being. They'd hired 3 additional staff members, chosen not just for technical skills but for commitment to service that made customers feel genuinely cared for. Sarah had become Emily's unofficial consultant on family-friendly business practices. The best part about Saturday lunch, she reported after the first month, is that parents actually get to eat their food while it's still hot, because their kids are happy instead of bored or fussy. This observation led to refinements in everything from seating arrangements to meal timing, creating an environment where family dining felt relaxed rather than rushed. But more importantly, it reinforced Emily's understanding that the most valuable business insights often came from paying attention to human experience rather than focusing exclusively on operational metrics. As winter settled over Manhattan and the restaurant's warm lights became even more welcoming against early darkness, Emily reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that rainy Tuesday afternoon. The woman who had once measured every decision against quarterly earnings was now planning expansions based on community well-being. The mother who had felt overwhelmed by caring for one infant was now helping create environments where multiple families could thrive together. On a snowy December evening, as Emily sat in Miller's kitchen holding Grace, while Sarah read them both a story, and Thomas prepared evening soups with movements so practiced they seemed like meditation, she experienced complete contentment that had nothing to do with accomplishment or acquisition. She was exactly where she belonged, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who loved her not for what she provided but for who she was becoming. This was success redefined, achievement that couldn't be measured in dollars but could be felt in warmth of genuine relationships, satisfaction of meaningful work, and deep peace that came from knowing her daily efforts were making the world better rather than simply making her richer. And as Grace fell asleep in her arms to the sound of Sarah's gentle voice and warm hum of satisfied customers, sharing good food and easy conversation, Emily understood that she had found something worth more than all the wealth she'd accumulated. A life that felt true to values she was only now learning to fully embrace.